Millionaire adopts a 12-year-old street girl, but days later she discovers something dark from the millionaire's past that shocks her. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching the video from. We love getting to know our viewers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more exciting stories. Enjoy the story and see you soon. I never knew what it was like to have a home, but what I did know was what it felt like to be abandoned again and again. Carla walked through the deserted streets of a small town in the heart of the United States. The shadows of the night fell over her, but it didn't matter. Darkness had always been her most loyal companion, just like the cold that froze her bones. No matter how fast she tried to walk, the weight of loneliness always caught up with her, as if it were an invisible shadow that never left her side. Just hours earlier, her adoptive parents, with whom she had lived for the past 2 years, told her they were moving, without her, as if she had never been a part of their lives. The word adoption had lost all its meaning for Carla. It was no longer a home, but a way station, a place she never truly belonged. And now, for the second time, they were leaving her behind, as if she meant nothing. The worst part wasn't the abandonment, but the feeling that there would never be a place to stay, nor a family to wait for her. At 12 years old, she already understood that no matter how much she wanted to hold on to a place or people, she would always be rejected in the end. She walked aimlessly, thinking that maybe it would be better to get lost in some faraway city where no one knew her, where she could reinvent herself or simply disappear. People passed by without even noticing her. No one asked if she was okay. No one offered help. Indifference was her only friend. But then something changed. In the middle of her despair, Carla looked up and saw a man entering an elegant building with a distracted expression, as if he didn't notice the world's pain around him. Something about him made her stop. People like him, with expensive suits and a cold gaze, usually ignored her, as if she were invisible. But he didn't. He didn't seem in a hurry, and that small pause in his stride was all Carla needed to approach him. "Sir," her voice trembled as if she were breaking a rule she didn't even understand. "Can you help me?" The man, who seemed about to enter the building, stopped and looked at her. He was around 45 years old, with a face marked by experience and years of struggle. His gaze, initially empty, seemed to capture her for a moment. Without saying a word, he gestured for her to come closer. "What's wrong, little girl?" he asked in a low but deep voice, as if he already knew what tormented her. And Carla didn't know how to respond. She felt she couldn't trust anyone, but something in the man's gaze made her feel that maybe this time it was different. Her heart beat faster, and for a moment she thought of leaving, disappearing into the city's shadows as she always did, but something inside her told her she couldn't keep running. "My parents, they left," she finally said, her eyes filling with tears. "They left me here, alone." The man watched her for a moment, saying nothing. Carla thought she might have frightened or uncomfortable him, but instead of turning around and continuing his way, he looked at her with something resembling compassion. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked after a long silence. Carla was in shock. No one had ever offered her something like that, without conditions, without asking for anything in return. A stranger who, just like her, carried something that made him alone. Something in his face, though marked by suffering, made her feel trust. "Really?" she asked, her voice broken. "Really?" the man replied with a slight, sad smile. "Come on, I'll take you to a place where you can rest." The man took her to his car, a large, dark vehicle that seemed as impersonal as the mansion where he lived. Carla watched it, feeling a mix of confusion and hope. She had never had anyone willing to offer her the most basic thing, shelter. But at the same time, one question tormented her. Who was this man really? Why was he willing to help her? That night, Carla learned that this stranger, Jorge, a successful entrepreneur and owner of a large technology company, had his own demons, something that, like her, had made him build an invisible wall around his life. Jorge's story was just beginning, but Carla had a feeling that their encounter hadn't been by chance. Fate had brought them together at a moment of pain and emptiness. The uncertainty still lingered as her companion, but for the first time, something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. Jorge's mansion was as imposing as it was cold. Carla watched it in silence from the car seat, feeling her stomach churn. In her life, she had been in many houses, but none had ever felt like a home. She had been constantly moved from place to place, never finding a corner that welcomed her. Now, in front of that gigantic house, she didn't know what to expect. Could this be the exception? When Jorge invited her inside, there were no grand gestures or promises of comfort, just a simple welcome, accompanied by a look that seemed to say much more than his words expressed. Carla barely dared to look inside, and for a moment she thought it would be best to turn around and run. But something held her back. The same feeling she had when she first saw Jorge. Maybe this would be her last chance. Maybe here she would find something she didn't even know she needed. The interior of the house was the complete opposite of what she had imagined. The decor was modern, with neutral tones and furniture that didn't invite contact. The walls, clean and cold, seemed to hold secrets that would never be revealed. In the distance, Carla could see a couple of abstract paintings on the walls and a huge window letting in the moonlight. Everything in that house screamed loneliness, but a deep loneliness so dense that it almost felt tangible. "You can go to your room. It's at the end of the hallway," Jorge said, his voice sharp but kind. Carla nodded, not knowing what to say. She walked down the long hallway, looking at the closed doors, all with an unsettling stillness. At the end, she found a door slightly ajar and entered. The room was warmer than the rest of the house, but still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Sitting on the bed, Carla carefully observed the few pieces of furniture, a large bed, a nightstand, and a lamp casting a soft light on the white walls. There were no decorations or family photos, just an empty bed waiting for someone. "What do I do now?" she thought, feeling the knot in her stomach. The door opened slowly, and Jorge appeared in the doorway. He was holding a cup of tea, as if that were the only way to break the silence surrounding them. "I know this is difficult," he said, with an expression that was both distant and compassionate. "But I want you to know that you'll be safe here. You don't have to worry about anything." Carla looked at him intently. It was strange to hear someone speak with such sincerity, especially someone she had just met. But there was something in his eyes that told her Jorge wasn't used to showing weakness. In fact, he seemed more lost than she was. "Thank you," she replied softly, but her words didn't calm the storm inside her. Jorge stood in the doorway for a few seconds, as if he wanted to say something more, but in the end, he said nothing. He just nodded and left quietly, leaving Carla with her thoughts. As the night wore on, Carla's mind kept racing. On one hand, she felt relief at being off the streets, no longer wandering aimlessly, but on the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that all of this was too strange. Why had Jorge brought her here? What was he looking for in her? And most importantly, could she really trust him? It was several hours before Carla finally fell asleep, and during that time, her mind never stopped spinning. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't understand. Jorge's loneliness was palpable in every corner, and something told her that, even though he didn't say it out loud, he needed Carla just as much as she needed him. But there were still too many unanswered questions. The next day, when she woke up, Jorge was nowhere to be found in the house. She decided to explore a little more, hoping to understand who she was dealing with. She walked through the hallways, curiously observing every detail, until she came across a locked office. Although she didn't want to invade Jorge's privacy, she couldn't resist the temptation to peek through the crack in the door. What she saw left her completely bewildered. Inside, there were a lot of photos of a woman smiling with Jorge in several of them. She was a young woman with warm eyes and a laugh that seemed to light up the room. But what caught her attention the most was a photo where they were both hugging with a smile that seemed to belong to a happy family. Carla stood there, staring for a few seconds until a thought crossed her mind. Who was that woman? With that question echoing in her head, Carla decided to return to her room. Something inside her told her there was more to Jorge's life than he was willing to share. The next day brought no answers. Carla woke up early, but instead of finding Jorge, the house was so silent it gave her the feeling of being trapped in a distant world. It wasn't the kind of comfortable silence one enjoys. It was the heavy kind, the kind that crushes you and makes you feel like you don't belong anywhere. She decided to go downstairs to the dining room, but there was no sign of Jorge. She sat at the table, observing the perfectly aligned plates and the immaculate cups. Everything seemed too organized, as if each thing had a precise place, but without life, without warmth. As she observed, she noticed something strange. There wasn't a single personal object anywhere in the house. No photos, no mementos, not even a simple frame with a family smile. Just spotless, empty furniture. A shiver ran down her spine. Carla knew that Jorge must be somewhere in the house, but she couldn't help feeling like an intruder. Though he had welcomed her kindly, something in his attitude made her doubt. She couldn't put her finger on what it was, but she could feel that behind his kindness there was something else. An invisible wall. That day, Jorge didn't appear until the afternoon, and when he did, he seemed like he was escaping from something. He didn't speak much. He just told Carla she could do whatever she wanted in the house, and if she needed anything, she should ask. But the distance in his tone, the lack of genuine interest, made her feel like she was in the way, like she wasn't welcome. Carla tried to get closer, to break through the wall she felt around him, but whenever she tried to start a conversation about his life or the house, Jorge always found a way to change the subject. As if he didn't want to talk about himself, as if something in his past was too painful to touch. Why is he treating me this way? Carla thought, walking through the mansion's hallways, observing everything around her. Her steps were soft, almost cautious, as if she were afraid to make a sound and break the stillness of the house. Jorge's house felt more and more like a prison, a place where the doors were open, but at the same time, no one dared to enter each other's emotions. By the end of the day, as she settled into her bed, Carla began to wonder if she was really better off here, or if she was just exchanging one type of loneliness for another. In her adoptive parents' house, even though she felt ignored, there was a certain comfort in the routine. Here, in Jorge's mansion, everything felt empty. But what troubled her most was the feeling that Jorge was running from something much bigger than her. There was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher, something that every time she looked at him felt like it was tearing her apart inside. What was going on in his life? Why had he chosen to help her, but at the same time, he didn't seem to want to help himself? The sound of the door opening pulled her out of her thoughts. Jorge appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. He didn't look directly at her, but she noticed his eyes were more tired than ever. "Would you like to go for a walk?" Jorge asked, as if he wanted to break the silence that had surrounded them all day. Carla looked at him, surprised. She hadn't expected an invitation, much less on such a strange day. She decided to accept, though something inside her told her not to let her guard down. She didn't know Jorge well enough to trust his kind gestures. The walk was short. Jorge took her to the garden, a large space but equally cold, with a couple of wrought iron benches and a fountain that never seemed truly alive. There were no trees for shade. The air was dry and heavy, as if the very earth were keeping its secrets. Throughout the walk, Jorge didn't say a word. Carla looked at him, but he didn't return her gaze. His face held an unsettling calm, as if his mind was elsewhere. From time to time, Carla observed him more closely, trying to understand what lay behind that indifferent facade. But every time their eyes met, she felt as though he were building an even larger wall between them, something invisible she couldn't even touch. When they returned to the house, Carla no longer knew what to think. The hours seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Jorge was there, but at the same time he was so absent that it felt like she had never truly known him. That night, while Carla was in her room, she couldn't stop thinking about the photos she had seen in Jorge's office. Who was that woman with the smile that seemed to speak so much? Could it be that behind his coldness, Jorge was holding on to something he hadn't let go of yet? In that instant, Carla began to understand something fundamental. Jorge hadn't just built a wall around himself. He had been running from something much bigger, the pain of loss. The dawn brought with it a thick fog that slid over the mansion's garden, giving it a ghostly air. Carla watched from her window as the day began to awaken, yet she still felt the same sensation that something dark floated in the air, something the house didn't want to reveal. Jorge didn't appear during the morning. Sometimes it seemed like he faded away in the days, as if his presence was just a shadow that appeared and disappeared. Even though Carla tried to stay calm, the lack of interaction with him unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She decided to take a walk around the house, a bit tired of the endless hallways and the stillness that seemed to take over everything. The cold morning air caressed her face, and for a moment she allowed herself to think that she was alone, but not in the sense of abandonment. She felt there was a small sliver of peace in that moment. As she walked toward the forest surrounding the mansion, something gleamed in the distance at the base of an old tree. Intrigued, she approached, and when she crouched down, she saw something that surprised her. An old wooden box, partially buried under a pile of dry leaves. Carla carefully pulled it out, wondering what could be inside. Her curiosity overtook her. Why was something buried in the garden? Was it some kind of secret that Jorge had forgotten? With trembling hands, she opened the box, and what she saw took her breath away. Inside were several black and white photos, some wrinkled by time. But what caught her attention the most was one particular photo. It was of a man and a woman embracing with genuine smiles, surrounded by a warm and familiar atmosphere. The woman was the same one she had seen in the photos in Jorge's office. Carla, with her heart pounding in her chest, couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man in the photo, with an expression of pure happiness, was Jorge. Who was that woman? What was her relationship to him? And more importantly, why was all of this buried in the garden? Without thinking further, Carla quickly put the photo back and ran toward the mansion, determined to find Jorge and confront him with her questions. When she entered the house, she found Jorge in his office, staring intently at a computer screen, completely absorbed. It seemed like he hadn't noticed her presence. "Jorge," she said, trying not to sound too accusatory, but also making her curiosity clear. "Who was that woman in the photos?" Jorge slowly looked up, as if he had been expecting that question to come at some point. His eyes immediately darkened, and the atmosphere in the room shifted, becoming charged with palpable tension. Carla watched him, waiting for an answer. "She was my wife," he finally replied, his voice breaking. "Her name was Marina." Carla felt a punch in the stomach upon hearing that name. She knew there was more, something behind that story that wasn't being told. What happened to her? Carla asked, almost without meaning to, but unable to stop herself. Jorge remained silent, staring at the floor. For a moment the room was filled only with their breathing. Finally, he lifted his gaze, and what Carla saw in his eyes made her take a step back. There was something in him that seemed to be breaking, something that had been held back for a long time. "She died 6 years ago," he said, his voice low, almost as if the words were difficult to get out. "In a car accident." Carla didn't know how to respond. She had seen the pain in Jorge's eyes before, but this was different. It was as if all the weight of his suffering was being released in that moment. The atmosphere between them filled with deep sadness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carla asked, feeling a mix of frustration and compassion. She knew there was more behind Jorge's indifferent facade. Something had broken him, something that kept him trapped in that never-ending mourning. Jorge remained silent for a few more seconds, then got up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the garden with a distant expression. "Because I still haven't gotten over it. Because I don't want to talk about it. It's easier to live in silence." Carla watched him, realizing that in some way her story and Jorge's were intertwined in ways she couldn't fully understand. She too had lived in silence, holding on to her pain. She had been abandoned so many times that she had stopped expecting anyone to listen. But now, seeing Jorge, she understood that shared pain can, in some way, ease the weight of loneliness. Not knowing exactly what to do, Carla slowly approached him, but without invading his space. She couldn't force a conversation, but she felt that something important was happening, something that might bind them more than she had thought. "You're not alone, Jorge," she said softly, not knowing if those words meant anything real to him, but feeling the need to say them. Jorge looked at her, his eyes soft, as if in some way he recognized the truth in what Carla had said. For a brief moment, they stood in silence, with the weight of their pasts hanging between them. The following days were strange for Carla. Although Jorge seemed more open, the atmosphere in the mansion remained tense. The moments they shared were sporadic, and every conversation felt like they were walking on broken glass. Jorge had started to share more about his past, but always in fragments, as if he couldn't find the words to describe everything he had lost. Carla, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about what she had learned about Marina. The woman who had been the center of Jorge's world, his wife, the one who had been taken from him in an accident, still lingered in his life in a way that Carla didn't fully understand. Every time Jorge mentioned her name, something in his face would change, as if for a brief moment all the pain would return to his chest. It was as though he couldn't let go of that ghost, and it kept him trapped in his own story. One day, after one of her brief walks around the mansion, Carla found Jorge in his study, staring at one of the old photos of Marina. His face, as it had so many times before, was marked by sadness, but there was something different in his expression. It was as if the pain was taking shape, as if he were trying to confront it once and for all. Carla didn't say anything at first, but the need to understand what Jorge was feeling was growing inside her more and more. She decided to approach him, but this time with more calm, not pressuring him. "Were you happy with her?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. Jorge slowly lifted his gaze, as if he hadn't heard the question, or as if he were calculating whether it was worth answering. "Yes," he finally replied, a sad smile on his lips. "With her, everything was easier. No matter what happened, I always felt like I could endure it, because she was by my side. But that's over." Carla, feeling that the distance between them was growing, with every word Jorge spoke, moved closer. Somehow, she knew she had to find a way into his heart, even though he was so closed off. In his eyes, there was a void that reminded her of her own, that hollow space that forms when everything you've known crumbles. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've lost many things too, and even though it wasn't a person, I know what it feels like to be completely alone." Jorge looked at her for a long moment, and although his face didn't change, Carla felt something inside him stir. It wasn't a grand emotion or a burst of joy, but a faint flicker of understanding, as if his own pain had found a reflection in hers. "It's not the same," Jorge murmured. "You've had the chance to start over. I don't know if I want to start again." Carla took another step toward him, unafraid, not knowing if what she was about to say would change anything, but feeling that she couldn't stay silent. "What happened to us isn't what defines our future. Maybe I don't have a family, but what I have now is a chance, or at least, that's how I feel. You gave me a chance, Jorge." Jorge looked at her intently, but for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Carla saw something more in his gaze. It wasn't just sadness. There was something of recognition, as if he were beginning to understand that, despite everything he had lost, he still had something to fight for. "I don't know if I'm capable of offering you what you need," Jorge replied in a low voice, "but I promise I'll try." Carla couldn't help but smile, even if it was just for an instant. Something inside her told her that maybe things could change, that perhaps the space they shared could become something more than an empty mansion. Maybe, just maybe, it could become a home. From that moment on, the small interactions between them began to change. Jorge, although still a closed-off person, started showing her more details about his life, about Marina, and about the pain he had lived through. Sometimes they spoke without saying much, but in those shared silences, there was a connection that slowly grew. For her part, Carla began to understand that it wasn't about healing overnight, but that the first step was to build something between them, something that neither pain nor time could destroy. It might not be easy, but at least they weren't as alone anymore. The mansion, though still cold and distant, began to seem a little warmer. Maybe it wasn't the perfect place, but Carla felt that for the first time she was building something worthwhile. That place, which had once felt so foreign to her, was slowly becoming her refuge, and even though the future remained uncertain, there was one thing Carla was sure of. With Jorge, she wouldn't be alone. Carla had slowly begun to adapt to her new life in Jorge's mansion. Although the house remained cold, his small gestures made her feel that maybe the door to a deeper connection was opening between them. But something still didn't quite fit. Jorge's past was still too heavy a burden for both of them, and Carla couldn't help but feel that the shadows of that loss were still lurking. One afternoon, while Jorge was in a work video call, Carla decided to go for a walk in the garden. The afternoon was warm, and the cool air gently touched her face as she walked along the same path she'd explored a few days earlier. Something in the landscape seemed to soothe her, but at the same time, her mind kept turning over her relationship with Jorge. Although there had been progress, he remained an enigma, so close and yet so distant at the same time. It was then that she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. In the distance, near the edge of the garden, was a familiar figure. It was André, Jorge's brother, the psychologist whom she had heard Jorge mention several times, but whom she had never met in person. André was standing next to a bench, gazing out at the horizon with an expression so serious it seemed he was absorbed in his thoughts. Carla, without thinking too much, decided to approach. Something inside her told her that maybe André could offer her a different perspective on her situation. As she approached, he saw her and with a faint smile greeted her. "Hello, Carla." His voice was soft, but with a certain melancholy that caught her attention. "How are you?" "Good. As good as it gets," Carla replied with a tone of uncertainty, feeling there was more to that question than it appeared. She decided not to avoid the conversation. "And you? Jorge always talks about you, but I've never really gotten to know you." Andre sighed and sat down on the bench, gesturing to the empty space next to him. Well, I'm the older brother," he said, his voice turning a little more serious, as though the words didn't want to come out easily. "I was never very good at family relationships. Jorge and we have a complicated history." Carla sat down next to him, taking her time, willing to listen. She knew that in some way Andre had something to say, something that could offer her more clarity about what was going on in the house. "Why complicated?" she asked, looking at Andre's face, which seemed to be struggling with his own memories. "Because I was the first to fail him." Andre fell silent for a moment, as if the words weighed more than anything else. When she died, I was far away. I was focused on my work, on my life. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to be there for Jorge. Carla looked at him, trying to understand. Andre's pain was different from Jorge's, but just as deep. Something in his voice told her there was more, much more. "Do you blame yourself for not being there for him?" Carla asked, feeling like the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit. Andre nodded slowly, his face marked by a sadness that seemed to come from a very distant place. "Yes, if I had taken a different path, if I hadn't been so focused on my own problems, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Maybe I could have prevented the accident, and then Jorge wouldn't be like this." Andre's voice cracked slightly, and Carla felt the weight of his words. For a moment, Carla understood. She understood the guilt Andre felt, but she also understood the emotional distance between him and his brother. Both had lost Marina, but in very different ways. Jorge, it seemed, had decided to isolate himself completely, while Andre had been in another kind of distancing, one based on guilt and the inability to face what he truly felt. "I'm really sorry, Andre." Carla softly touched his arm, trying to offer some comfort, even though she knew words couldn't lighten the burden he carried. "But maybe what both of you need most is to talk. It's not too late for you two to reconcile." Andre looked at her, and for a moment it seemed like he had lost his gaze in a past that couldn't be changed. But then something in his eyes shifted, perhaps for the first time. He allowed himself to see that Carla, a girl who had gone through her own pain, could understand more than he thought. "Maybe you're right. But it's not easy, Carla. Jorge, he's closed off. I don't know if he still trusts me after everything that's happened. I don't even know if he trusts himself." Carla sighed, knowing the answers wouldn't come easily. But at least now, she understood a little more about the situation. There were two broken men under the same roof, and although they didn't share their pain in the same way, both needed to heal. Sometimes we just need someone to listen, Andre, someone who understands us without judging. Andre looked at her intently, then smiled, though it was a sad smile. "I guess that's something we both need. Thank you, Carla." Carla stood up from the bench and looked at Andre one last time, before walking toward the mansion. She felt that something had changed in that conversation. Not everything was resolved, far from it, but there was an opportunity. An opportunity for Jorge and Andre to heal, together. And even though the future was still uncertain, Carla no longer felt as alone in her struggle. There was a path to follow, and for the first time, she felt she had the strength to move forward. The house, which had for so long been a cold and empty place for Carla, began to feel different. Although there were still spaces that held shadows and echoes of the past, something in the air had changed. There was something more, something subtle but real. Perhaps it was Jorge's small gestures, or the long conversations Carla had with Andre. Maybe it was Marina's letter, which still resonated in her mind, but Carla felt that something was about to happen. One day, while Jorge was in his office, immersed in endless work meetings, Carla decided to spend the day outside. She needed clarity, a space to think about everything that had happened in the past few days. She headed to the small lake near the mansion, a quiet corner that, though unfamiliar to her, seemed to hold the peace she so desperately sought. The sound of the calm water and the song of the birds gave her a break from her restless mind. When she arrived, she sat by the water, watching her reflection, though she would have preferred not to see the image of the girl who still appeared in the mirror. The lost girl, who had been rejected by so many, now seemed different. There was something more in her gaze, something that hadn't been there when she first arrived at the mansion, something that perhaps had always belonged to her. But the uncertainty about her future still lingered, like a shadow waiting to strike. Suddenly, the peace she had found by the lake was interrupted by a familiar figure. Andre. He was standing at a distance, as if he had been watching the lake for a while, lost in his own thoughts. Carla wasn't surprised to see him, but she didn't know how to react. There was something tense in the atmosphere between them, something unspoken. "I didn't expect to see you here," Carla said, standing up slowly. Andre approached, walking with firm steps. His face was serious, as if he were carrying an invisible burden. Something in his posture made Carla uneasy, as if he was about to say something important. "I've been looking for you." Andre's voice had a gravity that made Carla fall silent, waiting for him to say something more. He looked at her with an intensity that disarmed her. For a long moment, both of them stood in silence, only listening to the sound of the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. "There's something you need to know about Jorge, something I've never told you, but I think it's time you hear it," Andre began, his voice lower now, as if he feared someone else might overhear. Carla furrowed her brow, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. "What is it?" she asked cautiously, as she had a feeling that what he was about to say would not be easy to hear. Andre hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words, and finally found them. "The accident. It wasn't just Marina's fault. It was both of theirs." His voice trembled a little, but Carla's unwavering gaze encouraged him to continue. "Jorge wasn't in the car when it happened. He had argued with Marina that morning. He was so angry, so closed off in his own world, that he didn't want to go with her. He let her go alone. It was a decision he never forgave himself for, Carla, and it torments him every single day." Carla froze, as if the air around her had become thick. She had never imagined that the story Jorge had told her would take such a turn. Jorge's guilt didn't only come from Marina's death, but from something much more complex. He hadn't only lost his wife, but also the opportunity to be with her in her final moments. Andre, as if he had read her thoughts, continued, "Jorge has never told anyone. Not me, not anyone else. It's something he's carried in silence, because he believes that if he ever said it out loud, he would lose any hope of redemption. That's why he pulled away from everyone, and that's why he buried himself in work and in his pain." Carla felt Andre's words hit her like a punch to the chest, as if all the truth had fallen upon her in one blow. The weight of Jorge's guilt was deeper than she had imagined, and now she understood finally why he couldn't escape that darkness. He wasn't just trying to rebuild his life, he was trying to forgive himself for a decision he could never undo. Andre observed Carla's reaction and, with a sigh, sat down beside her at the edge of the lake. "I know this will change the way you see him, but what I need you to understand is that it's not as simple as it seems. Jorge needs to heal, Carla, and he won't do it if he keeps carrying this burden alone." Carla didn't know what to say. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but the truth hurt more than she had expected. She felt a mix of compassion for Jorge and a deep sadness for what he had lived through. But there was something inside her that urged her not to give up. She too had been a broken person, someone who had had to learn to trust again. If Jorge could overcome his own pain, maybe she could find peace as well. "I'll help him," Carla said, with a determination that surprised even herself. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let Jorge sink deeper into his guilt. It was time to face what they had both been avoiding: the pain, the past decisions, and the possibility of healing. Andre looked at her as if he were seeing a completely different person. "That's what he needs most, Carla. And maybe that's what you need too." They both sat in silence for a moment as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Something had shifted in the air. The truth had come to light, and with it, a new hope for both of them. The cold morning air felt different, fresh and full of promises. Carla woke up early, a strange sense of determination running through her veins. After the conversation with Andre the night before, something had changed within her. There was a new clarity in her heart, something that pushed her to act, to take a step beyond the emotional distance that still existed between her and Jorge. She knew he was trapped in a cycle of guilt, that every moment of his life was marked by the regret of that fateful morning. And now she understood, albeit incompletely, why he couldn't free himself from his torment. That day, Carla decided to confront Jorge. No more evasions or uncomfortable silences. She needed to talk to him, to look him in the eye and say what neither of them had said until now. But she knew that doing so would not be easy. The house was quiet when she left her room. She headed to Jorge's office, a place that had always been marked by an atmosphere of work and efficiency, but now, in her mind, also represented the shadows of the past. She knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice firm, but somewhat fearful. Jorge lifted his gaze from his computer. His face reflected exhaustion, but also something else, something Carla had never clearly seen before. Vulnerability. He nodded without saying a word, and she entered, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. They sat facing each other, in a thick silence that seemed to surround the entire space. Carla didn't know where to start, but the words came to her as if they had been waiting to be spoken. "Jorge." Her voice broke slightly at first, but she took a deep breath and continued. "I know what happened. I know what happened with Marina." Jorge frowned, clearly surprised. For a moment it seemed like he was about to say something, but then he fell silent, as if the words failed him. "Andre told me what happened that morning, that you weren't with her." Carla's gaze was direct, with no reproach, just a sincere look, ready to listen. "It wasn't your fault, but I know you've been carrying that burden all this time. And maybe, in some way, I understand you. I've carried my own weight." Jorge, unable to look directly at her, let his gaze drift to his hands. The guilt was written in every line of his face, every wrinkle, every gesture. "I don't know, Carla. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself." Jorge's voice was barely a whisper, but Carla heard each word like a deep echo resonating in her heart. Carla watched him for a long time, her mind spinning between past memories and the reality she was living now. She remembered how she had felt the same despair and abandonment when she first arrived at the mansion. How, although Jorge had welcomed her, she still felt like a stranger in her own life. But now she understood that, like her, Jorge was searching for redemption. He was looking for a place to belong, a place where his soul could rest, just as she was. I also feel guilty, Jorge." The confession came from deep within her, unprepared, without preamble. Carla had carried this feeling for years, believing that her abandonment had been her fault, believing that she didn't deserve anyone's love. "I always thought my life didn't mean anything, that no one wanted to keep it, but I found something here. I found something in you, in Andre, something that makes me believe that maybe, just maybe, my life can mean something. Jorge slowly lifted his gaze, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. He didn't say anything, but in his eyes reflected a mixture of surprise and relief, as if, finally, he were understanding something he hadn't been able to grasp for so long. "You," Jorge began to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. Finally, with a visible effort, he continued, "You're not a mistake, Carla. You never were. I don't know how to start saying what I feel, but maybe this is a start. Maybe together we can find a way out of all this, to forgive ourselves." The silence between them transformed. It was no longer an uncomfortable or heavy silence, but a space filled with understanding, a quiet truce that both of them needed. Carla knew that there were no easy answers, but in that moment, something in her heart told her that maybe things could change. Not everything would be fixed immediately, but the possibility of healing was already in the air. "Jorge, I want to stay." The declaration came naturally, as if her words had been waiting to be spoken. "I want to stay here with you, as part of this family, if that's what you want too." Jorge looked at her intently, and for a moment, Carla thought he wouldn't say anything. But then, with a faint smile, he nodded. "I'd love that, Carla. I'd love that." In that instant, Carla felt something break inside her, but it wasn't a painful break. It was the shattering of the old chains that had kept her captive for so long. In her eyes sparkled a glimmer of hope, because in the end, she had found a place where maybe she could belong, a place where perhaps Jorge could heal too. They both sat in silence for a moment as the light of day began to fade, giving way to the night. But inside the mansion, in their hearts, a new light began to shine. The days seemed to stretch on in Jorge's mansion, and despite the small emotional victories Carla was experiencing, the feeling of incompleteness still lingered. Although she had taken a step toward her new life, there was still something unresolved. The invisible wall that Jorge had built remained there, between him and her, like a boundary that stood firm despite their efforts to get closer. And guilt, the heavy guilt, continued to be the shadow that haunted him. One afternoon, while Carla was exploring the mansion's library, something caught her attention. On a somewhat hidden shelf behind a row of books that had never been touched, she saw a small wooden box, carefully closed. Her curiosity led her to open it. Inside, there were several letters tied together with a string. Some seemed yellowed with time, while others still held the scent of fresh ink. Without thinking much, she began to go through the letters, and that was when one, in particular, caught her eye. It was a letter written in a delicate feminine handwriting, dated a few months before Marina's accident. Carla, without thinking, pulled it out of the box and opened it gently, as if unveiling a very deep secret. It was Marina's voice, and Carla felt that, in some way, the woman who had been a mother to Jorge, but could never be one to her, was there, speaking to her from the past. "My dear Jorge, I know we've talked a lot about our life together, but I never want you to forget what I want to say the most. Despite how difficult it has sometimes been, you have always been my home, and although our paths didn't lead us to become biological parents, I have always known that our family is made of much deeper bonds than blood. You and I, together, created something stronger than anything else. There are days when I feel so empty and others when happiness overwhelms me, but I know that all I want is to see you happy. I love you more than words can express, and I will always be by your side in everything you do. I love you, and I always will, Marina." Carla's heart sped up as she finished reading the letter. In that moment, the air in the room thickened, as if the weight of those words was about to crush her. Marina had been much more than Jorge's wife. She had been a woman who lived with a deep desire to be a mother, to form a family. The letter spoke not only of love, but also of a silent sacrifice, of a hidden pain. Carla, with the letter in her hands, began to understand something she had never fully understood before. Jorge had lost Marina, but what he didn't know was that, in some way, Marina had left him a final opportunity. Marina's desire, in her words, was clear: for Jorge to find happiness, and maybe in a way he hadn't imagined, that happiness could lie in her. While Carla was lost in her thoughts, someone entered the library. It was Jorge. "What are you doing here?" His voice sounded a bit tense, but also curious. Carla looked up and saw the surprise on his face when he saw the letter in her hands. It was as if a fog of discomfort had settled between them. "I found this," Carla tried to say calmly, but there was something in her voice that betrayed her surprise and sadness. "A letter from Marina. You never told me about this." Jorge approached slowly, and for a moment it seemed as if his strength had left him. The expression on his face became somewhat empty, as though a piece of his soul had been ripped away. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. He took the letter from her hands and reread it, his trembling fingers touching the words written with so much love. "It's one of the last ones she wrote to me." He fell silent for a moment, as if digesting everything that the letter had represented. Then, with a heavy sigh, he continued, "I haven't told you, Carla, not because I didn't want to, but because I'm still not ready to talk about it. Marina was the love of my life, and guilt, that damn guilt, it doesn't let me go. It's never let me go." Carla watched Jorge with a mixture of sadness and understanding. On one hand, she could see the depth of the love he had for Marina, but she could also see the weight of his guilt, the one that had left him trapped in an endless cycle of pain. "Jorge, Carla started to speak, but he raised his hand, asking her to let him continue. "No, Carla." His voice became firmer, and something in his eyes changed. It was as if finally he was ready to face what he had been avoiding. "The letter isn't just a farewell, it's a message I never fully understood. Marina always wanted me to be happy, but I refused to listen because I felt that the only way to honor her memory was to stay trapped in my pain. I never thought that happiness, for me, could mean anything other than her." Jorge looked at Carla with a vulnerability she had never seen before. It was as if, for the first time, he was letting someone see him as he truly was, a broken man who had been chasing a dream that no longer existed. "I didn't know how to start over, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive myself for not being there with her." A single tear ran down his face, something Carla had never imagined seeing. "But now that I have you here, I realize something. Marina left me a gift I hadn't seen before." Carla stepped closer, feeling the weight of Jorge's words. She knew what he was trying to say, even though he didn't say it clearly. The time had come to heal, to rebuild, to live. "The gift is me, right?" Carla whispered with a light smile, but one full of understanding. Jorge nodded slowly. "Yes, Carla, the gift is you." That simple affirmation changed everything. The bond between them, which had been fragile and distant for so long, was now full of meaning. Somehow, Carla's arrival had been the answer to Jorge's pain, the opportunity Marina had left him to heal. And though they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, they also knew that together they could face it. Carla, with her presence, and Jorge, with his renewed love, began to weave the first threads of a new family. The sun filtered weakly through the curtains of the mansion, signaling the start of a day full of possibilities. Carla woke up early, as usual, but today something was different. Not only did the air feel lighter, but inside her it seemed as though something important was about to happen. There was something new in her heart, a feeling of belonging that until a few days ago had seemed impossible. After everything that had happened, Carla knew that her life in some way had changed forever. In the last month, her relationship with Jorge had evolved in ways neither she nor he had expected. They had faced the ghosts of the past together, the guilt, the insecurities. They had shared their deepest pains, and at last they had seen each other without masks or barriers. The mansion, which had once been a cold and empty place, was now beginning to feel like a home. But there was still something missing. Something that Carla hadn't mentioned to Jorge, even though she had been thinking about it for a long time. Since the day she read Marina's letter, something in her heart told her that she needed to take that step, that she needed to ask that question. A question that would not only change her life, but also Jorge's. That morning, after a quiet breakfast, Carla saw him in the distance, in his office. He was lost in his thoughts, as always. Carla approached with determined steps. There were no more doubts, no more insecurities. "Jorge." Her voice was firm, but her eyes held a contained emotion. "I need to talk to you." Jorge looked up with a smile that, although somewhat shy, reflected the understanding they now shared. Something had changed in him. He had opened up, allowed hope into his life, and Carla, with her strength, had been the spark that ignited that light. "What's going on, Carla?" he asked, looking at her with interest. She took a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage. "I want to be adopted." The words came out of her mouth with absolute clarity, without hesitation. It wasn't an impulsive decision, nor a last-minute request. It was something Carla had been feeling for weeks, something she could finally express. Jorge stared at her, initially stunned. For a moment, it seemed as if the words didn't quite reach him. But then, something appeared in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, emotion, and something more. Something Carla had never seen before, something that seemed to be the answer she had longed for. "Carla," Jorge began, his voice trembling, as if the words were harder to speak than usual. "Are you sure about what you're asking?" Carla nodded firmly, stepping a little closer to him. "Yes, I'm sure. I found my place, Jorge. I found my place here with you. And although I could never be Marina's daughter, I feel that maybe you can be the father I've always needed. Not as a replacement, but as a new beginning." Jorge's confusion melted away, and what appeared on his face was a mix of restrained joy and relief. His eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of a happiness he hadn't felt in years. The weight of guilt and sadness was starting to fade, replaced by a warm light that illuminated his face. "Carla," he said, barely whispering, and then, with deep emotion, he continued, Of course, you can be my daughter. I accept you, with everything you are and everything you've been. I've always wanted a family, but I never knew how to find it. But now, here with you, I think I've found it." Jorge's words resonated deeply in Carla's heart, filling her with a calm she had never known before. In that moment, nothing else mattered, no matter what the past had reserved for them. What mattered now was the present, and that present was filled with love, hope, and a future that, for the first time, looked clear. At that instant, the doorbell rang, and Carla glanced toward the entrance, wondering who it could be. Jorge stood up to check, and when he returned, he had a smile on his face. "It's Andre," he said, with a meaningful look. Carla looked at him, not quite understanding. "What's going on with Andre?" she asked. Jorge, with a look full of tenderness and complicity, replied, "He's been an important part of this journey, and I know he'll also be happy to hear this. But more importantly, I know he's helped me understand what it means to be part of a family. And now, the three of us can be one." When Andre entered, there was no need for Carla to say anything. The look exchanged between the three of them, the understanding in their eyes, was enough. There was no need for empty words anymore. A family had been formed, a bond created. not by blood, but by love and mutual acceptance. That afternoon, Carla felt more complete than ever. Not just because she had found in Jorge what she had been searching for her whole life, but because at last she felt part of something much bigger. She wasn't a lost child, nor an abandoned young woman. She was a daughter, a sister, and most importantly, she was loved. In the heart of the mansion, where once there had only been echo and solitude, a home had been born. A home where the wounds of the past were healed with time, and where love became the strongest bond between all. And as the sun set on the horizon, lighting the future Carla now knew she deserved, she smiled. Because she understood that in the end, everything she had lived had brought her to this moment, to the place where she belonged, with a family that finally loved her. And so we come to the end of this emotional story of overcoming, redemption, and above all, love. Carla finally found what she had been searching for, a place to call home, and Jorge, the chance to rebuild his life alongside someone who truly understands him. Their journey wasn't easy, but together they learned to face their own ghosts, and in the end, they formed a real family. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Carla's decision to ask to be adopted by Jorge? Do you believe that forgiveness, both towards others and ourselves, is truly possible, just as they managed to overcome their traumas? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any touching stories like this one. We want to know what you think, so leave a comment below. And if you know someone who would be moved by this story, share the video with them. Let's spread the message that there is always a second chance, no matter what the past has left us with. See you in the next video. Until soon.